Hey ladies, this is Mokomami here bringing you another video. And in this video, I want to talk about divestment. I show up in the divestment algorithm. I'm putting that in air quotes, okay? But I don't think that I'm truly divested. Yes, I'm married interracially. No, I don't live in like a predominantly Black crime-ridden neighborhood or send my kids to send my kids to private school. But I don't consider myself divested simply because of how invested I am in the social and economic progress of Black women. Because I'm so invested in Black women and our progress, I don't think I can call myself divested from the Black community. So what I'm trying to say here is that my dedication to Black women and understanding the historical significance of why Blackistan, I'm putting that in quotation marks, is the way it is, and having compassion for those circumstances is one of the reasons why I can't consider myself divested. But I'm going to tell you the story of the most divested person I know, and that's my dad. So in order to understand my dad, you would have to understand effective Black patriarchy. Okay, so my dad grew up in an effectively Black patriarchy. His grandfather owned a general store. And so he was the father of 9 children, which then my grandfather was one of the definitely the youngest son of the 9 children. So when you run a business, you don't need all 9 of your children to run that business. So what you would do is send some of your sons off to create a legacy of their own. And your business would be a launching pad for them. So maybe the older sons would run the business, but the younger sons would do different things. Like I had one great uncle who went into the Negro Leagues to play baseball. I had other uncles who had served in World War II as officers in segregated units. I had my grandfather who ended up going to the skilled trades. Some of them ended up going to HBCUs. To be educators or to be or to go to the A&M and A&T schools to kind of learn agriculture and agricultural business and science. And then the daughters of Black patriarchy would typically marry into families that had similar interests in business alliances. For instance, one of my aunties married a guy who worked in for the Coca-Cola bottling company and in distribution. We all know that Black vendors and Black business owners to this day have supply chain issues. In 2021, Black business owners are having supply chain issues. So back then, it was even more prominent. So if your daughter married somebody who was in distribution or worked in the shipyards and who can give you an inside track as to when vendors and would bring in fish or supplies from overseas, you could pretty much guarantee success for your business. Nobody married a guy because he was a nice guy. Nobody married somebody because they were trying to help a brother out. You married somebody because you were trying to continue that family's legacy. So let's just say that business was passed down to my father, and then my father was the patriarch that ran that family's business. That business is long gone. It's no longer in our family, but let's just say that business got passed down to my dad. Our job as his daughters, because he had no sons, our job as his daughters was to go to the Howards and the Hamptons and to bring back Black excellence. We were to bring back the Black MBAs, the Black businessmen, the men who knew e-commerce and venture capital, who could take that business into the next generation. That was what our job was as the daughters of Black patriarchy. So when you hear these men talking about Black patriarchy and marrying somebody because they're a nice guy or because they're quote unquote good Black man, that's a man who doesn't understand patriarchy. Patriarchy is about power, and their power moves on every level. There's no emotional, he's a nice guy decisions that are made in Black patriarchy. So after World War II, a lot of Europe was pretty much in shambles, even the Allied forces who had won. So America kind of became the world's breadbasket. It became the hub of manufacturing and agricultural industry that kind of fed the rest of the industrialized world. So a lot of the World War II soldiers who were kind of coming back on the economy were also fighting like a two-front battle. They were fighting civil rights to enter into the mainstream workforce, and a lot of them won some of their concessions simply because America needed workers, particularly skilled laborers. So those were maybe the aircraft and vehicle mechanics coming out of World War II, a lot of the skilled laborers coming out of the A&T and A&M, HBC, historically black colleges, and definitely on the heels of organized labor and the Pullman car porter strike that happened in the 1920s had also made a lot of headway when it came to the integration of Black people into labor unions. Definitely, ladies, read that story, because I think that that's an important part of our history as a working population in America, as Black workers in America. That's definitely one of the most pivotal, important parts of our history. So what was happening is you saw, like, even though organized labor was never really completely welcoming to African American workers, you definitely saw concessions being made. Because they had to, right? Because you had somebody like my grandfather who was part of an autonomous Black economy. And now the United States kind of needs his skilled labor. So he was definitely my grandfather was one of the first people to integrate the labor unions, the New York City Electrical Brothers Union in particular. So even though, like, legislative wise they were integrating, there still was a lot of cultural things he had to fight. He was definitely overqualified and underpaid for a lot of the jobs that the union had for him, but he saw the bigger picture, what it would mean for the future for Black skilled tradesmen overall, not just electricians, but licensed contractors and plumbers. So you really saw, like, them fighting these two front battles for civil rights and also for the rights of us as workers. Now you see a lot of organized labor pandering to Black people. That certainly was not the case in, like, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So because my grandfather's generation integrated the unions that were very much a stronghold for especially Irish immigrants, second, third generation Irish immigrants, well, second, third, and fourth generation Irish immigrants. My dad was coming in, second generation, really seeing all the frustration, all the degradation, all the difficulties that my grandfather had. So he is integrating this union, knowing that he has to be twice as good to earn half as much, and then bringing young men up behind him. So that was his job. That was his role. I will always have respect for my dad. My dad, who would see, he would know a family was struggling, and he would be the guy who would leave groceries on their back porch anonymously, or put money in their mailbox. He was the guy who would help connect other young Black men with other business owners, whether it be a fast food franchise or a grocery store, or with their first job. He would definitely be one of the guys who would help young Black men get a driver's license. He would help teach them to drive and get their learner's permit so that they would have ID on them, because we know a Black man walking around with no ID in New York is an issue. It still is to this day. So he was very instrumental in helping our community, helping even when we went to church. And it was kind of customary in church for when someone was going off to college or trade school, was that young man or young woman would go up in front of the church and hold a collection plate, and everybody in the congregation would put money in. My dad was definitely very generous in that respect. So I'll always have respect for my dad for doing things like that for the young people that I grew up around. But even with all of that dedication to the community, the thing that mostly derailed him was when the crack bomb went off. Okay, so the crack epidemic did a couple of things. Number one, you had a lot of Black men who thought that it was recreational, like reefer, right? But it was much more addictive, and that could really just completely derail a young man who may have had a positive trajectory. That's definitely what happened with my dad's brother and many of his cousins and friends he went to school with. They thought that it was like reefer or marijuana, and they thought it was recreational. And that derailed a lot of them because it was not recreational. It was highly addictive, and it would almost ruin and destroy their families. And in many cases, it did. It also created this underground economy. Like, this is going to get a little explicit. An underground, like, sex worker economy, where women who were crack addicted would often sell themselves and their children in order to support their habit. And one of the things that was happening in the union at the time, my dad is a shop steward. My dad and grandfather are both shop stewards in the labor union. So guys who were in the union, while they were on the clock, no less, were going into these drug-addicted neighborhoods and soliciting services from these addicted women and many times their children on the company's dime. Okay, this is during work hours. And while they were getting their services, a lot of times they would end up getting robbed. Maybe their pagers, their tools, sometimes even their whole work trucks were being robbed. So if you were on the clock and now all of a sudden your tools end up missing, your pagers end up missing, your truck ends up missing because you're doing it during work hours because you're trying to hide it from your family. So then you would be subject to disciplinary action. When you're subject to disciplinary action, you go to the union to see if you can try to mitigate the circumstance to prevent yourself from getting fired. So they would go to people like my grandfather and my dad was like, be like, hey, help me. I got my tools stolen, or my truck was stripped, or my pager was stolen. Can you help me? So first of all, you go to these men, they're God-fearing men. So first of all, they're not going to condone your behavior. And secondly, you have to file a police report. If not, you end up fired. But then you can't tell what you were doing. So that just put my dad and my grandfather in these very awkward positions because, of course, you would have to file a police report, and then the union could then be like, okay, well, this was stolen while he was on the job. And then the union, they would have to, the company would have to file like an insurance claim, but you need a police report to do that. But they were somewhere where they weren't supposed to be during work hours. So it was just basically got really complicated where like my dad and my grandfather were put in these very compromising positions. Well, a lot of times because these men were where they weren't supposed to be, they would end up getting fired. And there was nothing my dad as a shop steward or my grandfather as a shop steward could do about it. So they went from being some of the strongest advocates for black men to being like the quote unquote mark-ass busters in the department because they couldn't stop these men from getting fired because it was what they were doing on company hours. Now, is that to say that the white workers were not doing it? They were, okay? But here's the difference. A lot of these guys were like third, fourth generation Irish immigrants, and they were very well connected. So let's say that you did the exact same thing that a black electrician did, and you got your pager or your tools or your truck stolen during work hours because you were getting a $10 BJ from a crackhead or her daughter that she was trafficking to you. So let's say that the same exact thing happened. You pretty much knew other guys in the union, or you had an uncle or a grandfather or a friend of the family who could put you on another job before you got subject to disciplinary action. You knew other people in the police department who can create a police report for you to make it look like maybe you weren't doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. And because they were well connected, they were able to kind of get away with it. Whereas my father and my grandfather, they didn't have those type of connections. They hadn't been there that long. My dad was second generation. My grandfather was actually still working in that same union. Like he was still working in those same companies that were unionized. So they were not as well connected as some of these guys who were third and fourth generation. So therefore, the white Irish descendants of immigrants can get away with a lot more. So my dad, when he was saying like, hey, you have to be twice as much to be half as good, you have to keep your nose clean, you have to not get involved in this stuff, that was really the best he could do, because he really didn't have the connections at the police department or at the insurance company or in the higher levels of the company that can move you and transfer you before you became subject to disciplinary action. Because we didn't have those type of connections, and the white union members did, my dad became kind of like a target. He was like the Mark Ass Buster. That was the name that they used to call my dad when he would go into work. So here he was advocating for these guys, advocating for them to get licenses, advocating for them to learn to drive, advocating for them to get promotions. But at the same time, they're stabbing him in the back because they can't get away with getting $10 BJs on the job while they're on the clock like the white union workers could. Now, another thing that really distinguished my dad's situation from that of the white workers was the fact that he lived in the neighborhoods and pretty much saw how this was affecting our community. I'll give you an example. A lot of times when the white workers went home, they would go into like their homes in the suburbs of like Long Island, Jersey, Connecticut, getting on the ferry. My dad pretty much saw this in their neighborhoods. They would see like, wives in the grocery store, the wives of these union workers in the grocery store have their checks bounced because, the husband never confessed that his checkbook was stolen while he was running with some crackhead. I remember there was a time when my mom, whose family is basically black church royalty, they were all at some like midnight prayer meeting because there was a woman in our congregation who had a husband who worked with my dad. She was in the hospital having what we now know was a miscarriage. We were all in the church praying that night, all night, while she was in the hospital. And it was because basically she had gotten an STD for the second time because of what her husband was doing on the clock with these crackheads, basically, these women in the projects while he was on the clock at work. We also saw like women kind of like crying in church, coming to the house, wondering what they're doing wrong as wives and were they enough, or questioning their womanhood, and all these tears, and just basically pouring their heart out to people like my mom and my aunts and my nana, because they knew that their husbands were having affairs. And my dad knew that it was like, here you are, these women are questioning their marriages, their God, and wondering about the future of their families. And these guys are just basically running around chasing like hood rat ass crackheads. Like that's basically who was breaking these families up. Crackhead prostitutes were breaking these families up. And my dad had a front row seat to not only how it was affecting their careers, but how it was affecting their families. And they're mad at him because he won't let them get away with it. He has no power to let them get away with it. So it was just a really sad time for him, and it was frustrating for him. To see young boys that he had invested hours and hundreds of dollars in time in teaching them to drive and helping them get their license, only to find out that they would not even piss clean when it came time for them to apply for jobs. And he's putting his neck and his name on the line. So it was difficult. It was a difficult time. Shout out to new content creator, Black Women, who shares a similar story about her upbringing in North Philly 2 generations later. This would be somebody who would be young enough to be one of my little cousins, who shares a similar story when it comes to her upbringing, growing up in the shadow of the methamphetamine epidemic of North Philly. So shout out to that content creator sharing her experience and how detrimental and difficult her upbringing was. So I'll leave a link to her channel in the description box. The straw that broke the camel's back when it came to my dad had to be the death of his brother and the death of one of my mother's brothers. That happened within the same 2 to 3 year period, just due to complications from prolonged drug abuse and use. And then my grandfather's retirement. Once my grandfather retired, my dad left the labor union. He felt that he had fulfilled his obligation to help young Black men get into the skilled trades. And unfortunately, African American men are still very underrepresented. There's 6%, only 6% of African American men are actually licensed in the skilled trades, even despite the double digit growth for all other ethnic groups since 2010. So when we wonder, so after the death of my mother's brother, my father's brother, and the retirement of my grandfather, we headed out to the suburbs with my uncle Mike, who was starting his own landscaping business. Now, perhaps maybe he's the most divested one in the family because he had left a long time ago and never even bothered to work with my dad and my grandfather in the labor union. But once we moved to the suburbs, we didn't see a lot of our family members again. We didn't participate in a lot of the activities that we used to participate in. And even though my dad is still very generous when it comes to a lot of charitable events and even some of my Pan-Hellenic events, even though my dad never pledged, he still will write a check, but he won't really show up. He's pretty much exhausted and done with dealing with the collective, even though he'll be financially generous, but really won't participate a lot in some of those organizations, activities, church groups, and community organizations that he once participated in. So I would say that watching his evolution from the time that I was in maybe fifth grade, the time I was 9, 10, 11 years old, to even when I was devastated from being uprooted, and my older sister was devastated from being uprooted because we were in high school or about to approaching high school, at least when we moved, never really understanding why my dad uprooted us and then pretty much alienated us from almost everything that we knew and everyone that we knew, including family. Seeing his divestment journey really led me to leave the life and live the life that I really wanted to. So even though I didn't understand at the time, looking back, I am very grateful for the example that he set, that we can build new alliances, we don't owe anything to anyone, and that we can do what's best and self-advocate for our families, for our futures, and for ourselves. This is Mocha Mami, and I'll see you in the next video.